On today's episode on Retro Car Guy 530, we're going to be working on the rear suspension of this 2014 Chevrolet Caprice PPV. My 2014 Chevrolet Caprice PPV has just under 113,000 miles on it. As you can imagine, the front and rear suspension components need to be refreshed after that many miles. I'll be working on the rear suspension in this particular video. In a future video, I will be working on the front suspension. In a moment, I'll show you the parts that I'll be using to replace the rear shocks and end links. If you find the information in this video informative or entertaining in some way, make sure you hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, make sure you do so, and hit that bell notification to be notified when I upload new videos to the channel. If you want more information about the parts used in the video or any other related information, make sure you check out the links in the description section. And if they're affiliate links and you use those links to purchase those products, I will make a commission. That will be a great way to support the channel at no extra cost to you. I do now have an Amazon influencer store, so check out that link in the description section as well. Look for the tools and items that I used on my channel, reviewed or used in the videos, and see if they're helpful to you. If you purchase those, that will also help the channel. So let's get into showing you the parts that I'm going to be using. And also I purchased a specialty tool a while back to hopefully make the coil spring compression a little bit safer and easier. Here are the parts I'll be using to refresh the shocks, the end links, and necessary components related to the shocks. In the rear of this 2014 Chevrolet Caprice PPV, this should apply to the 2014 through 17 Caprice and probably the 14 Chevy SS sedan. 15 through 17 were mag ride, so those are different. But the shocks I was able to get on Amazon a couple months ago on a closeout, and they were like $44 a piece. I think they're about $80 to $90 each normally, so that was a pretty good deal. And they come with a new rubber bushing for the bottom of the coil spring, so that's already refreshed on that part. I have the two new end links. They come with the two nuts to torque those down, so I'll be replacing those as well. I have the one-time use nuts here that are necessary to gain access to drop the shock out. So those will be replaced. I have two new bushings for the top of the shock mount as it mounts to the body. So it took a little research and confirming the parts because some of the parts vendors weren't willing to ship it because they said it didn't match the VIN, but thankful to a couple other Chevy Caprice owners, they were able to locate and confirm the part numbers I had already ordered, and that's what I have for that. And then the two top of the coil spring isolation rubber pieces, I got two new ones of those just in case these are deteriorated. With 113,000 miles, I can imagine everything's pretty grungy under there. So let's go over and check out the tool that I'll be using for the spring compression now. Here's the spring compressor I'll be using in this particular exercise today. First time I'll be using it. I bought it actually mainly for the front struts to compress the springs for that, but it should apply to the rears as well. This is a JackTech spring compressor. It's a fairly expensive tool. But after replacing the Chevy SSR front springs, shocks, and taking the springs off of those, the hand compressors for those, they can be done safely. It's always a little sketchy in my mind to be torquing on those individually. So this is going to solve that for me, and hopefully it works out. So you get to see it in use for the first time for me in this video. Another tool that I purchased for this particular repair is this set of ESCO low profile jack stands, ESCO part number 10499. The reason for that is I want to keep the vehicle as relatively level on the garage floor as possible, and these low profile jack stands allow me to do that. I used a pinch weld adapter and my floor jack to elevate the side of the vehicle. Then I placed this jack stand with a nice large rubber pad it has at the lift point on the rear of the Caprice, and then dropped it down to that, where it basically kept the vehicle as level as possible on the garage floor. I also used some wheel chocks around the front wheels, and I placed an older rim and steel rim and tire underneath the vehicle as a safety precaution. That way, in case anything did fail, it would fall onto that tire and rim. But things worked out quite well, and I was quite happy with this purchase. So check out the information about those parts down in the description section as well. One of the reasons I elevated both sides of the vehicle at the same time was to remove the tension between the sway bar and the lower control arm. That allows the removal and installation of the end links to be accomplished with far less effort. And I found that these end links appeared to be replaced sometime in the not too distant past, but they appear to be aftermarket as well. They weren't loose, but they were worn to some degree. And the nut was a 15 millimeter with a and E-Torx for the center stud. The AC Delco part was a 17mm nut with a 5mm Allen wrench to torque it in. This is the last time I'll show you both sides because I learned some lessons from the driver's side when I first attempted the reinstallation of everything down at the point of reconnecting the knuckle to the lower control arm, and I'll show you that over on the passenger side, and everything else is pretty much the same. So from this point forward we'll show just the passenger side, but keep in mind you'll have to do the same thing on the driver's side. We're going to remove the bolt on the lower end of the shock mount first, then release the bolts on the top, then the lower control arm to the knuckle, and then jack down the lower control arm, leaving the knuckle approximately where it is to let them separate, and then pull the shock out. This is an 18, right? Yes, 18. And we have the 18 for this side, right? Yes. Make sure we're going the correct direction. This is a one-time use nut that will be replaced. We're going to remove the bolt from the lower shock mount into the lower control arm. Then we're going to loosen the bolts on the upper shock mount to the body. I'm not going to fully remove the bolts at this point. I'm going to leave them in there so that when I drop the lower control arm and get the shock ready to pull out, it doesn't drop out unexpectedly. I'm going to put a floor jack underneath the lower control arm right below the shock mount area to support the tension and the weight right now. Then I'll get ready to remove the bolts at the knuckle end of the lower control arm. And then I'll put my scissor jack underneath the knuckle to support its current position as well, so I can eventually drop the lower control arm from the knuckle. Now I'm going to pry out the lower part of the shock from the lower control arm to pull it out, and then drop the shock assembly out from the vehicle. I'm now going to remove the old shock from the spring and replace it with the new shock and all the various components. I'm going to use my new JackTech SK3000 spring compressor, and it's going to make this a lot easier. I used some hand torqued spring compressors when I replaced the shocks on the front of my Chevrolet SSR. It can be done, it's just I just prefer to have something a little more stable, and this seems to be an excellent tool for that process. So let's get it mounted up into the spring compressor here. Let's get these out of the way first. I've already staggered the placement of the two bottom pieces here to match the elevation rate of the spring. So bring it in so that it stands and is clamped by the bottom ones here. Okay, let me go one spring down. There we go. There. Rotate it just a little bit to avoid the metal there. Bring this down to the area where I can clamp. Bring that in there. Looks like that's a good distance. Let's bring it down. It's engaged on both. I'm going to tighten these. We're engaged on the bottom, we're closed. And this will ratchet and stay in place with the appropriate amount of tension. I have an 18mm socket, or wrench at this point. I have a 6mm Allen for the center to hold it. So let's go ahead and start compressing it to relieve the tension off of here. Shock is released from the tension of the spring, and that will hold until I release it later on. And looks like we're engaged there, engaged there. These are fully engaged, so we're secure. Grab the shock on the bottom. So we have the nut, we have the washer with the protruded raised ridge down towards the isolation mount here. So let's set this off to the side. And now we should be able to lift this off. We have a new isolation plastic ring, rubber ring, for that. The corresponding washer here comes off. Then we have the cap, dust cover. It should come up here. That's in good shape. And then we have the bump stop, which is in good shape. And now we can just drop the spring off from the bottom. And we're going to get a new isolation ring for the bottom of this, or yeah, for the spring, if I can find the word there. And it's already on the new shock. Looks like this wasn't leaking. But that's what we have there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go off camera here, clean up the spring to make it look a little more presentable and clean up some of the parts. Then I'll come back when I'm reassembling the shock. I now have the spring cleaned up, the dust cap and all that, and the top mount. I have the clip taken off the top of the shock here to allow it to expand. And I've got a new nut for the top because those are one-time use nuts. And I'm going to orient the bolt in a direction like this that is, if you want to call it parallel to this, but yeah, I'm using this as the point here as the line, so I'm saying 90 degrees are perpendicular to that because that was the orientation before. If we look at the old shock, we can see the bottom tip of the spring came to here, so that was basically with an orientation like that. So I'm going to orient it that way as well. So actually, if we look at this, we can see that the bottom of the spring was right at like the edge of that, so it wasn't quite 90 degrees on that one. So that would mean I would need to insert it from the bottom. And that basically right there, that's pretty much the same orientation. All right, so let's get the bump stop in here. It's been cleaned up. Get it on the top part of the shock. Okay. Then we've got the cap. Goes on the top of that. Yeah. That's on. Then we have the washer that goes on top of that with the ridges protruding upward, pushing and pointing upward. Now we can see that I don't have the new plastic or rubber ring there, so I'm going to set it on the spring itself. Attempt to set it on the spring itself. And get it oriented correctly. It wasn't going fully on here, so. Here we go. Looks like we might need to crank this down just a bit further. Get everything in place. We'll worry about the orientation a little bit after we get the washer and the nut on loosely. So I don't have to hold the bottom. Once the extra tension is released, that should pop up directly where it needs to be. And make sure we're oriented where we need to be there. So we have the bump stop, the insulator cap, the washer on top of the insulator cap. We have the top mount, which abuts against the washer on the bottom side. We also have the isolation ring in place. Okay, and I'm now going to tighten this down. It's a 6mm. As we saw when I took it off. There we go. And it's supposed to be 34 foot-pounds torque. So you can get a torque wrench to actually go on there without the center Allen. Now it's rotating. All right, let's try it again with the wrench. And now let's make sure we're still oriented correctly. That's the right spot. We have the tip of the upper part of the spring at the point on, see if I can rotate this around. We have that right here. See if I can get a flashlight for that. So this is correctly abutted to the end of the spring and it's up against the mount. So now I should be able to release. Make sure we're where we need to be. Looks good. And the beauty of this tool is I just need to rotate this counterclockwise to expand it. This is torqued. Yep. And then so the isolation, or the insulator ring up there is on the spring where it should be. The end of it is at the end of that, and it's in the crevice that needs to be there. And the tip of the bottom here is in the same spot as the indent on the insulator on the bottom of the old shock and spring, or old shock. So this looks like it's ready to go back in. We're now going to reinstall the newly refurbished shock assembly. So we're going to attempt to get the top of the shock up into the hole here, and then get the base of it over the lower control arm plate here. It was a little challenging to get it out, so let's see what it's like to get it back in. Repositioned. That wasn't as difficult. The new nuts. low setting. You need to torque these once they're on the ground. The suspension's on the ground, so it's going to get them snug, not torqued. 18mm nut and bolt head. Oops. Go on setting 2, because we have a lock nut, anti-use lock nut here. Same thing with the shock. .3. I can't get to that one in the corner very easily, so let me get an extension for that one. .3.5. Use the long extension I used to loosen it. A little over 44. So that's torqued. The shock lower mount bolt and the lower control arm bolt will be torqued when it's on the ground. Well, I'm going to leave the jack in place right now. I'm going to get the end link in case I need to do any up and down movement to make it align. I do have the other side already reinstalled. So just in case I may make any final up and down adjustments, I'll leave the jack there for the moment. So we have the 4 upper mount bolts torqued to 43 foot-pounds. We have the lower shock and lower control arm bolt tightened but not torqued yet. I have to be on the ground to do that completely. The end link has been new end link's been installed and torqued. At least I can't get a wrench given the proximity of the spring right there. At least I'll see if I can find another one, but I hand torqued it to approximately the same torque value of 34 foot-pounds. So I'm gonna drop the jack from the bottom of the lower control arm get the wheels back on and drop it down to the ground and do the torque of those 2 bolts on each side, and we should be ready for the test drive. I was going to lower the vehicle and tighten these 2 bolts, but the rims go in so far that I can't even get into here, so I simulated the weight by jacking up on the lower part of the knuckle, and it's basically almost supporting the weight of the vehicle, so that's effectively the way the weight of the would have been dispersed throughout the geometry of the rear suspension here if I had put it on the wheel. So the first of these 2, well, they both have a 120-degree angle after the initial torque. The shock lower bolt seems to have 2 different definitions, 30 pounds plus 120 or 59 pounds plus 120. I'm going to go with the 30 because that's the lower control arm bolt as well, 30 plus 120 degrees, so let's get that going. I was able to use my new Outtakes spring compressor, and that worked quite well. And then I also was able to purchase these low-profile ESCO jack stands to elevate the vehicle at just the right height. And then, of course, we removed the end links from both sides. With both sides elevated, the pressure was off the sway bar and the end links. Removed the bolt from the shock mount on the lower part in the lower control arm. Loosened up the bolts on the top, but didn't fully remove them quite yet until we got the bolts out on the bottom. Removed the bolt from the knuckle and the lower control arm to allow that to drop down. Extracted the shock from the lower control arm and loosened the bolts and removed the shock assembly. Went over, compressed the spring, got the shock out, put the new one in after I cleaned up the parts. Got it back over here, got the bolts on the top mount, and then inserted that into the lower control arm. Inserted the bolt for the shock, and using that pry bar, was able to align the knuckle and the lower control arm, torque the upper shock mount bolts, and then got down to the bottom where we put the end link back in on both sides. And then we learned the lesson of torquing these bolts afterwards, but I couldn't have the rims on, but it ended up working out just fine. And hopefully you learned something from this. I know I did. And here's a couple of outtakes from me trying to film a couple things, so hopefully I'll be including this in future videos. So thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Take 5,684 planes, cars, and water heaters. 3, 2, 1. My 2014 Chevrolet Caprice PPV has just under 113,000 miles on it, and as you can imagine, the suspension components need to be refreshed after that many miles. Both the front and rear balls. Take 5,432,000 cars, planes, and water heaters. 3, 2, 1. Car. 3, 2, 1. My 2014 Chevrolet Caprice PPV has just under balls.